The Dark Ages, truth behind Europe's forgotten era. The fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE marked one of the most dramatic turning points in human history. The empire that had stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, binding diverse peoples under law, culture, and roads, suddenly disintegrated. For centuries afterward, historians and writers referred to the following period as the Dark Ages. The phrase suggests a time of chaos, ignorance, and decline. 1,000 years of silence between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. But was this image true? Was Europe really plunged into unending darkness? Or have later generations painted an exaggerated picture of decline to make their own age appear brighter? The truth lies somewhere in between. While the early medieval centuries were indeed filled with challenges, wars, famines, the collapse of trade, and political instability, they were also a time of resilience, adaptation, and even progress. The so-called Dark Ages were not simply a void of civilization, but rather a complex era that reshaped Europe's future. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the world that had revolved around its armies and bureaucracy fragmented. Roads that once carried legions and merchants crumbled. Cities that had thrived on trade and administration shrank or were abandoned. Literacy, once widespread among the Roman elite, became confined mostly to churchmen and monks. For ordinary people, survival meant turning to the land. Agriculture replaced commerce as the foundation of life. Most Europeans became peasants, tied to estates, providing labor in exchange for protection from local lords. This system, which we now call feudalism, dominated social life for centuries. Yet to imagine this era as a static wasteland would be misleading. Even as Rome fell, new powers rose. Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards carved out kingdoms from the ruins of empire. The Franks, under Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries, created a realm that briefly revived the idea of imperial unity. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued to flourish, preserving Roman law and Greek philosophy. And in the wider world, especially in the Islamic caliphates of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, learning and science advanced at a breathtaking pace, later filtering into Europe. The Church was the one institution that survived the collapse of empire relatively intact, and it became the central force of the Middle Ages. To many people, the Church represented stability in a world of uncertainty. It controlled not only spiritual life, but also education, art, and even politics. Monasteries became islands of literacy, where monks preserved ancient manuscripts by laboriously copying them by hand. Without their efforts, many of the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Virgil would have vanished forever. Cathedrals, with their soaring spires and luminous stained glass windows, became not only places of worship, but also masterpieces of engineering and symbols of humanity's desire to reach upward toward the divine. Still, the Church's power had its shadows. Questioning its doctrines could be fatal, and heretics faced persecution. Independent scientific inquiry was often suppressed when it conflicted with theology. The Church launched the Crusades, a series of wars that, though justified as religious missions, also unleashed violence, greed, and cultural clashes between East and West. Yet paradoxically, the Crusades also reopened Europe to the knowledge, trade, and technologies of the Islamic world, accelerating change. The stereotype of the Dark Ages as an age of ignorance ignores many quiet innovations. Agriculture became more productive, with the introduction of the heavy plow, the three-field system, and the horse collar. Population slowly increased, towns began to re-emerge, and trade routes reopened. Inventions such as the mechanical clock, the windmill, and improvements in shipbuilding laid foundations for later progress. Even medicine, though primitive compared to today, benefited from translations of Arabic and Greek texts, especially the works of Avicenna and Galen. The so-called barbarians, who had once sacked Rome, were not mindless destroyers, but builders of new societies. The Vikings, often remembered only for their raids, were also traders, explorers, and settlers who reached as far as North America centuries before Columbus. The Anglo-Saxons in England produced literature such as Beowulf, while the Normans reshaped law and governance after their conquest in 1066. Each of these cultures contributed threads to the fabric of modern Europe. Conflict was constant. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted, and dynasties fought for power. But these struggles were also crucibles of identity. France, England, Spain, and the German states all began to take shape during this time. Out of feudal bonds, knightly codes of honor, and local loyalties emerged the first notions of nationhood. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the supposed darkness began to lift more visibly. Universities were founded in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris, teaching law, theology, and the natural sciences. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile faith and reason, drawing heavily on the rediscovered works of Aristotle. Trade fairs in places like Champagne and cities such as Venice and Genoa brought wealth and contact with distant lands. Gothic cathedrals rose over towns, testifying to both spiritual devotion and technical mastery. What we often forget is that the darkness was never total. While Europe faced setbacks, the Islamic Golden Age illuminated vast regions with discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and medicine. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi introduced algebra, while physicians like Ibn Sina revolutionized medical thought. These works, translated into Latin, reinvigorated European learning. In the Byzantine Empire, scholars preserved Greek traditions until the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when refugees carried their manuscripts westward, fueling the Renaissance. By the 14th century, Europe was poised for transformation. The Black Death devastated populations, but paradoxically, it also weakened the rigid structures of feudalism, opening opportunities for change. Artists like Giotto pioneered more naturalistic styles. Thinkers began to question old authorities. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art, science, and humanist philosophy, was not the sudden dawn of civilization after 1,000 years of night, but the flowering of seeds planted during the so-called Dark Ages. So why does the label Dark Ages persist? Partly because Renaissance scholars and Enlightenment thinkers wanted to highlight their own brilliance by contrasting it with what they saw as an era of decline. Partly because warfare, disease, and illiteracy were real and widespread in medieval Europe. But modern historians increasingly reject the phrase, arguing that it unfairly dismisses a millennium of history as meaningless. The Middle Ages were not an empty pause, but a dynamic, if turbulent, period that laid the groundwork for the modern world. In truth, the Dark Ages were not an age without light. They were an era of struggle, adaptation, and transformation. Out of the ruins of Rome, a new Europe emerged, one that blended classical traditions, Christian faith, and the innovations of diverse peoples. The cathedrals that still stand today, the manuscripts that carried wisdom across centuries, the laws and institutions that shaped nations, all were born in these so-called dark centuries. To call them dark is to miss their true legacy. They were not the end of civilization, but its rebirth in another form, an age of resilience that proved humanity can endure even when empires fall. Far from being forgotten, the Dark Ages remain one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters in history. An era where shadows and light intertwined, setting the stage for the dawn of modern Europe.